The metallic taste of fear coated Elsie Walker's mouth as she knelt beside the dying man, her blue calico dress already stained crimson. Blood, so much blood pooled beneath the wounded Navajo warrior, seeping into the cracked earth like a terrible baptism. Her hands shook as she pressed her petticoat against the bullet wound, knowing that in Dusty Fork what she was doing amounted to signing her own death warrant. "Please," the man whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with desperate intensity. They're coming. Tonight. Someone sold them maps." Elsie's breath caught. The raids that had terrorized the territory for months, the attacks that had left families butchered and homesteads burned, someone in town had been feeding information to the killers. The thought made her stomach lurch, but there was no time to process it. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, growing closer. "I can't," she breathed, then hated herself for the words. "They'll kill us both." The warrior's hand moved weakly toward a leather pouch. "Evidence. Military maps. Silver payments. The traitor, he's one of yours." Through the desert heat shimmer, Elsie could see riders approaching Clay Dorsey's men, no doubt drawn by the reports of an Indian spotted near town. In minutes, they'd find her here, helping the enemy, betraying her own people. The smart thing would be to run, to pretend this never happened, to let the man die alone under the merciless sun. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw not the savage monster Clay's speeches had painted, but a human being fighting for his life. The same fight her mother had lost 3 years ago, bleeding out in the dusty street, while neighbors watched from behind locked doors. The hoofbeats grew louder. Elsie made her choice. 2 hours earlier, the general store had been suffocating with more than just the August heat. Clay Dorsey's voice boomed across the cramped space, his weathered face flushed with righteous fury as he addressed the nervous customers. "Now mark my words," he declared, his gray eyes blazing. "These attacks aren't random. Someone's been feeding them information, telling them when to strike, where to hit. We've got a traitor in our midst." Elsie's father, Thomas Walker, looked up from his ledger with worry etched deep in his kind features. "Clay, that's a serious accusation. You can't just protect my neighbors." Clay's voice rose, commanding attention. "The Henderson Ranch, at the Miller Place, the trading post, all hit exactly when our patrols were elsewhere. That's not coincidence, Tom. That's intelligence. Then we should inform the territorial authorities," suggested Martha Henderson, her voice tight with grief. Her husband's death still weighed heavy on the small community. Clay's smile was sharp as a blade. "Authorities. The nearest cavalry post is 2 days' ride. By the time they investigate, we'll all be dead. No, we handle this ourselves. We find the traitor and we deal with him accordingly." The word traitor hung in the air like a noose, and Elsie felt the weight of every eye in the store. She'd been asking uncomfortable questions lately, suggesting that perhaps not all Indians were bloodthirsty savages, that maybe there were better solutions than the vigilante justice Clay advocated. "What if you're wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if there's another explanation?" Clay's attention focused on her like a predator scenting prey. "Another explanation, such as, maybe some of them aren't our enemies. Maybe they're trying to help." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Clay's laughter cut through the tension, harsh and bitter. To help girl, they butchered the Henderson family in their beds. They burned the Martinez homestead with the children still inside. "You think that's help?" "I think," Elsie said, her courage building despite her fear, "that we're letting grief and anger cloud our judgment. I think we're becoming the very thing we claim to fight against." Clay's face darkened. "Careful, Elsie. That kind of talk makes a man wonder whose side you're really on." The threat was unmistakable, and Elsie felt her father's protective hand on her shoulder. But she also felt something else, a spark of defiance that reminded her of her mother's fierce independence. "I'm on the side of truth," she said quietly, "even when it's inconvenient." Clay's smile never wavered, but his eyes turned cold as winter wind. "Truth has a way of biting those who think they can handle it, girl. Be careful it doesn't bite you." Now crouched beside the wounded warrior with Clay's riders bearing down on them, Elsie understood just how prophetic those words had been. The truth was about to bite her hard, and she wasn't sure she'd survive it. "Help me," she whispered to the dying man. "Help me get you to safety." Sani Redhawk, for that was his name, though she didn't know it, yet struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on her slight frame. "The mine," he gasped. "Old shaft, behind the rocks." Together, they stumbled toward the abandoned copper mine that had given Dusty Fork its name. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen boulders, a black mouth yawning in the desert floor. As they reached the opening, the thunder of hoofbeats grew deafening. "Elsie Walker." Clay's voice cracked like a whip across the desert. "Step away from that savage." She froze, half supporting the wounded man, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the heat shimmer, she could see Clay, and 3 of his men, their faces masks of outrage and betrayal. "He's hurt," she called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "He needs help." "He needs killing," spat Jake Morrison, Clay's most loyal follower. "Just like the rest of his murdering kind." Clay held up a hand, his calculating gaze never leaving Elsie's face. "You know what this looks like, don't you? Helping the enemy. Giving aid and comfort to the people who've been butchering our neighbors." The wounded warrior stirred against her, his voice barely audible. Not the enemy. Tracking them. Trying to stop them. Lies," Clay said, but something flickered in his eyes. "They all lie. It's their nature." "Listen to him," Elsie pleaded. "He's trying to warn us about something. He said someone in town has been—" "Someone in town is the traitor." Clay interrupted, his voice booming with authority. "Someone in town is helping the enemy, and we're looking at her right now." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Elsie had known this moment would come, but she hadn't expected it to hurt so much. These were her neighbors, people she'd known her entire life, and now they were looking at her like she was something vile. "I found him an hour ago," she said, her voice cracking. "He was already wounded. If I was working with raiders, why would I be helping an injured man?" "Maybe you lost your nerve," Jake suggested. "Maybe you couldn't finish the job." Sani's grip tightened on her arm, and she felt him trying to straighten despite his wounds. "Maps," he gasped, loud enough for the mounted men to hear. "Military maps, patrol routes, someone sold them." Clay's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "What maps?" "Supply lines, safe houses, someone in your town. Sold them to the renegades for silver." The words hit the riders like a thunderbolt. If there was a traitor in Dusty Fork, if someone had been feeding information to the raiders, then everything they thought they knew was wrong. "He's lying," Clay said, but his earlier conviction had cracked. "It's a trick." "The attacks." Sani pressed on his voice, growing stronger with desperation. "Henderson Ranch first, then Miller Place, then the trading post. All places marked on cavalry maps." Jake Morrison's face went ashen. "Boss, the cavalry did survey those locations. They wanted to establish patrol routes." "Shut up, Jake." Clay snapped, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. From the direction of town came the rapid clatter of hoofbeats, Sheriff Walt Harlan and his deputies drawn by the commotion. When they crested the rise, the sheriff's weathered face was grim. "Man, Clay, we've got problems." Harlan called out, his voice tight with urgency. The Martinez family was found dead at their homestead, butchered, and there are tracks heading toward town. The news hit like a physical blow. Another family dead, another ranch burned, another step closer to the nightmare that was approaching Dusty Fork. You see, Clay's voice was triumphant despite the horror. While we stand here listening to lies, they're killing our people. Sheriff, arrest this savage and the girl who's helping him. But Harlan was looking at Sani with recognition. Wait, I know you. You're the scout who worked with Captain Morrison last winter. Sani nodded weakly. Tracking the renegades. They killed my family, burned my village. I've been hunting them for months. The convenient timing. Clay said, his voice dripping suspicion. Shows up right before another attack. Not convenient, Sani whispered. Necessary. They're coming tonight, while you're divided, while you're weak. Sheriff Harlan's face was grave as he looked from Clay to Sani to Elsie. The man who'd kept the peace in Dusty Fork for a decade was caught between competing loyalties, paralyzed by the weight of his decision. Sheriff, Elsie said, her voice cutting through the tension, if there's evidence of a traitor, don't we have a duty to examine it? Evidence. Harlan's voice was barely a whisper. Sani fumbled with the leather pouch, producing several documents bearing military seals. Maps, reports, payment records. Everything you need to know about your traitor. Clay's horse danced nervously as he leaned forward. Don't touch those, Sheriff. They could be forgeries. Or they could be the truth, Elsie shot back. The truth you're so afraid of. Harlan reached for the documents, then stopped, his hands suspended in midair. The weight of the moment pressed down on him like a mountain. If he examined the evidence, and it proved Sani's claims, he'd be starting a witch hunt that could tear the town apart. If he ignored it and people died tonight, their blood would be on his hands. Walt. Clay said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Remember who your friends are. Remember who helped you get elected. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Clay Dorsey owned half the businesses in town, employed a quarter of the population, commanded the loyalty of the most influential citizens. Going against him would be suicide. I can't, Harlan said, his voice hollow with shame. I can't take the risk. The words hit Elsie like a slap. The law she'd trusted, the authorities she'd respected, had just abandoned her to Clay's mob justice. Then I will. The voice came from behind them. Father Miguel Santos, emerging from the desert heat like a mirage made flesh. The old priest's black robes were dusty from travel, his weathered face calm but determined. There, sir, Clay said, his voice tight with frustration. This is a legal matter. The church has no business. The church has every business when it comes to protecting the innocent. Santos replied, his voice carrying absolute authority. And that man is clearly wounded and in need of help. The priest moved toward Sani, his hands gentle but sure as he examined the bullet wound. This is at least a day old, he announced to the assembled group. This man has been running from something. Running from justice, Jake Morrison suggested. Running from renegades. Santos corrected. Look at his injuries. These aren't the wounds of a raider, they're the wounds of someone who's been hunted. Clay's face twisted with frustration. Father, with all due respect, you're not qualified to... I'm qualified to recognize suffering, Santos interrupted. I'm qualified to offer sanctuary to those who need it. And I'm qualified to know right from wrong. He helped Sani to his feet, supporting the wounded man with surprising strength. This man is under the protection of the church. Anyone who wants to harm him will have to go through me. The challenge was clear, and even Clay hesitated. Attacking a priest would be political suicide, even in a town as fractured as Dusty Fork. This isn't over, Clay said, his voice cold as winter wind. We'll be watching. As the riders retreated toward town, Elsie felt a moment of relief. But it was short-lived. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. And if Sani was right, the the real battle was just beginning. The church basement was small and cramped, lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Sani lay on a makeshift bed, his wounds cleaned and bandaged by Father Santos's experienced hands. The old priest had tended many injuries over the years, and his work was skilled and sure. "Tell me about these maps," Santos said as he worked. "Tell me about the traitor." Sani's voice was weak but clear. "Someone's been selling military intelligence to the renegades. Patrol routes, supply schedules, safe house locations. They know everything." "Who?" "I don't know. The renegades called him the White Eye who counts silver. Someone with access to cavalry reports." Elsie sat nearby, her hands still stained with blood, her mind racing. Clay seemed to know about the cavalry surveys. He mentioned them specifically. "Clay knows about everything that happens in this town," Santos replied. "That doesn't necessarily make him guilty, doesn't it?" Elsie's voice was sharp with suspicion. "He's been pushing for vigilante justice, stirring up hatred, dividing the community. What if that's exactly what he wants?" Santos was quiet for a long moment. "What if it is? What would we do about it?" "We'd expose him," Elsie said. "We'd show the town what he really is. And if we're wrong, then we'd be dead," Sani said simply. "But if we're right and we do nothing, a lot of innocent people are going to die tonight." The sound of footsteps on the stairs above made them all freeze. Father Santos moved to the basement door, his hand on the latch. "It's me," came a familiar voice. "Thomas Walker. I brought supplies." Elsie's father descended the narrow stairs, his arms full of medical supplies and food. His face was etched with worry, but also with a fierce determination that reminded her of her mother. "How is he?" Thomas asked, nodding toward Sani. "Alive," Santos replied. "But he's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest." "He won't get it," Thomas said grimly. "Clay's gathering a mob. Half the town's worked up about the Martinez family, and the other half's convinced there's a traitor in our midst." "There is a traitor," Elsie said quietly. "The question is who?" Thomas looked at his daughter, seeing the woman she'd become in the space of a few hours. "Are you sure about this? Are you willing to stake everything on the word of a stranger?" "I'm willing to stake everything on what's right," Elsie replied, "even if it costs me everything." Her father nodded, pride and fear warring in his eyes. "Then we'd better see what evidence he has." Sani struggled to sit up, his hands shaking as he opened the leather pouch. The documents inside were official and detailed military maps showing patrol routes and supply lines, intelligence reports outlining cavalry movements, and most damning of all, a payment ledger showing regular deposits of silver. $200. Thomas breathed, reading over the financial records. Someone's been paid very well for their treachery. Now look at the dates. Elsie said, her voice tight with realization. The payments correspond exactly with the attacks. Every raid, every massacre, every family butchered, it's all been coordinated. Santos studied the documents, his weathered face grave. "These are genuine military papers. The seals are authentic. But we still don't know who the traitor is," Thomas pointed out. "The payments are listed as D, but that could be anyone." "It's someone with access to military intelligence," Sani said. "Someone the cavalry trusts. Someone who's been to the fort recently." "Clay was at the fort last month," Elsie said suddenly. "He said he was discussing defense strategies with the commander." "So were half a dozen other men," Thomas replied. "We need more proof." The sound of shouting from the street above made them all freeze. Through the small basement window, they could see torches flickering in the darkness, hear the angry voices of Clay's mob. "Send out the girl and the savage." Clay's voice boomed through the night. "We know they're in there." Father Santos moved to the window, keeping low. "There must be 30 men out there, maybe more." Father Clay called out, his voice carrying false reasonableness. We just want to talk. Send them out and we'll discuss this like civilized people. Like you discussed it with the Henderson family, Santos called back. Like you discussed it with the Martinez children. The priest's words hit the mob like a slap, and the angry murmur that followed was ugly and dangerous. We don't have time for this, Sani said, struggling to his feet. They're out there arguing while the real killers are approaching. The attack will come soon. How do you know? Thomas asked. Because I've been tracking them for weeks. They always attack when the town is divided, when people are distracted by their own conflicts. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the desert. Single shots at first, then volleys, then the unmistakable crackle of a building on fire. The outlying ranches, Santos whispered. They're hitting the perimeter first. Clay's voice rose above the chaos. You hear that? While we're wasting time with traitors and savages, they're killing our people. But even as he spoke, more gunfire erupted, this time from the direction of the main road. The renegades weren't just hitting the ranches. They were surrounding the town. Everyone into the church, Santos commanded. Now, it's the strongest building we have. As they helped Sani up the stairs, Elsie felt the full weight of their situation crashing down on her. They were trapped in a town under siege, surrounded by enemies, both within and without. The mob that had come to lynch them was about to become their only hope for survival. The irony was bitter as poison. The church filled with terrified townspeople as word of the attack spread. Men, women, and children pressed against each other in the narrow pews, their faces pale with fear in the flickering candlelight. The beautiful stained glass windows that had once depicted scenes of peace and salvation now served as defensive positions as the men of the town took up arms. Clay Dorsey stood near the altar, his earlier anger replaced by grim determination. Whatever his faults, he was a natural leader, and the people looked to him for guidance, even as death rode toward them out of the darkness. Everyone stay calm, he commanded, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. We've faced raids before. We'll face this one too. Moki. How many? Asked Pete Sawyer, a young man barely out of his teens. Don't know yet, Clay replied, but we're ready for them. Sheriff Harlan moved through the crowd, distributing weapons and ammunition. The lawman's face was etched with shame and determination. In equal measure, he'd failed in his duty once tonight, and he wouldn't fail again. The windows. Sani said, his voice cutting through the chaos. They'll try to break the windows and throw torches inside. We need to cover them. Clay said, his voice cold as winter wind. Don't give orders here. He's right, Harlan said, surprising everyone. The windows are our weak point. We need to barricade them. As the townspeople scrambled to fortify their position, Elsie found herself next to Martha Henderson, the widow still dressed in mourning black. I'm sorry, Martha said quietly. About earlier, about what Clay said. You have nothing to apologize for, Elsie replied. You lost your husband. You have every right to be angry. But not at you, Martha said. Not at someone who was trying to help. Before Elsie could respond, the first shots rang out from the darkness beyond the church. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies as the renegades took positions around the building. Here they come, Sani said, his voice steady despite his wounds. Remember, they'll try to panic you, make you do something stupid. Stay calm, stay together, and we might survive this. The attack came in waves, each one designed to test the defenders' resolve. Bullets shattered the remaining stained glass, sending multicolored fragments raining down on the huddled masses. Fire arrows arced through the darkness, some catching on the wooden roof, others sputtering out harmlessly on the stone floor. The roof, Father Santos called out, pointing to the growing flames above. If it catches, we'll all burn. Several men climbed into the rafters, beating at the flames with blankets and coats. The acrid smoke filled the sanctuary, making breathing difficult and vision poor. They're trying to smoke us out. Clay observed his voice tight with controlled panic. Force us into the open where they can pick us off. Then we don't go into the open, Sani replied. We make them come to us. The wounded warrior had positioned himself near one of the broken windows, his rifle ready despite his injuries. His tactical knowledge was evident in the way he'd organized the church's defenses, turning the sanctuary into a fortress. You seem to know a lot about fighting. Clay said, his voice suspicious. I know a lot about surviving, Sani replied. Something you might want to learn. The next wave of attacks was more coordinated, more deadly. The renegades had apparently studied the church's defenses and were probing for weaknesses. They hit the side door with a battering ram while simultaneously attacking the main entrance and sending fire arrows at the roof. They're trying to spread us thin, Sani observed. Force us to defend multiple points at once. It's working, Harlan said grimly. We don't have enough men to cover everything. That's when the real horror began. Through the smoke and chaos, a new voice cut through the night, speaking in accented English, cold and mocking. People of the town. The voice called out, I am Broken Wolf. I have come to collect what is owed to me. The name sent a chill through the defenders. Broken Wolf was legendary among the renegades, a war chief who'd been terrorizing the territory for years, known for his cunning and ruthlessness. What do you want? Clay called back, his voice cracking with strain. What I was promised, Broken Wolf replied. What I was paid for. But first, I want the man who betrayed me. What man? The man who promised me silver for information, then tried to betray me to save his own skin. The man who thought he could use me and discard me like a broken tool. The words hit the defenders like a thunderbolt. Broken Wolf wasn't just attacking randomly, he was looking for someone specific. Someone who'd been working with him. I don't know what you're talking about. Clay called back, but his voice had lost its conviction. Don't you? Broken Wolf's laughter was harsh and bitter. Shall I tell them about our arrangement, about the silver you paid me to attack your neighbors, about the maps you sold me for 30 pieces of silver? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and every eye in the church turned to stare at Clay Dorsey, the man who'd been their leader, their protector, their voice of righteous anger, was being accused of orchestrating the very attacks he'd claimed to fight. Lies, Clay said, but his voice was barely a whisper. All lies. None. Then explain this. Broken Wolf called out, and something came sailing through one of the broken windows, a leather pouch that landed at Clay's feet with a metallic clink. With trembling hands, Clay opened the pouch. Inside were silver coins, still bearing the marks of the territorial mint, and a letter written in Clay's own handwriting detailing the locations and timing of cavalry patrols. You bastard. Martha Henderson breathed, her voice filled with horrified realization. You killed my husband. I didn't kill anyone. Clay protested, but his voice was hollow. I just provided information. I didn't know they'd... You knew, Sani said, his voice cutting through Clay's protestations. You knew exactly what you were doing. You sold out your neighbors for silver, and now you're trying to save yourself. The truth hit the defenders like a physical blow. Their leader, their protector, the man who'd stirred them to righteous anger, had been the traitor all along. He'd orchestrated the attacks, profited from the deaths, and then used the resulting fear to consolidate his power. Why, Elsie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do such a thing? Clay looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and desperate calculation. Because I was broke, he said. Because the ranch was failing, the debts were mounting, and I was going to lose everything. The silver was supposed to be temporary, just enough to get back on my feet, but it wasn't temporary. Father Santos said, his voice filled with quiet condemnation. It became a way of life. And now it's going to be the death of us all, Harlan added grimly. Broken Wolf's voice cut through their horrified realization. Send him out, the war chief commanded. Send out the traitor, and the rest of you may live. The offer hung in the air like a temptation from the devil himself. One man's life in exchange for the lives of everyone in the church. From a purely practical standpoint, it made sense. We don't trade lives, Father Santos said firmly. We don't sacrifice one person to save others. Even if that person is a traitor, Pete Sawyer asked. Even if he's responsible for all of this, especially then, the priest replied. That's what separates us from them. But even as he spoke, Elsie could see the doubt in the faces around her. These were desperate people facing certain death, and the offer of salvation, even at such a price, was tempting. Father's right, she said, her voice carrying across the sanctuary. We don't become murderers to stop murderers. We don't become traitors to stop traitors. Easy words, Jake Morrison said bitterly, but they won't stop the bullets. The argument was interrupted by a new sound and the crackle of flames as the renegades set fire to the church doors. The heavy oak had been soaked with oil, and it caught quickly, filling the sanctuary with smoke and heat. They're going to burn us out. Harlan said, his voice tight with panic. We need to do something. We need to fight, Sani said, struggling to his feet. We need to make them pay for every step. But even as he spoke, they all knew the odds were hopeless. 30 or 40 renegades against a handful of townspeople, most of whom had never been in a real fight. The church's thick walls provided some protection, but they also made it a trap. That's when Elsie noticed something, a small door behind the altar, partially hidden by shadows. She'd seen it before, but never paid attention to it. Now it might be their salvation. Father, she called out, where does that door lead? Santos followed her gaze, and his eyes widened with realization. The catacombs, he said. The old mine tunnels. They connect to the network under the town. Can we get out that way? Some of us, maybe, but not everyone. The tunnels are narrow, dangerous. Then we send the women and children, Harlan said. The rest of us hold them here. No, Sani said firmly. We all go or we all stay. If we split up, we'll be picked off one by one. The flames at the front door were growing higher, and the smoke was becoming unbearable. They were running out of time and options. There's another way, Clay said suddenly, his voice hollow with desperation. The old mine entrance. It's connected to the tunnels, but it's also big enough for everyone. Where? Santos demanded. Behind the church near the cemetery. There's a hidden entrance covered by brush. And you know this how? Harlan asked suspiciously. Clay's face crumpled. Because I've been using it, he admitted. To meet with Broken Wolf's emissary. To pass information without being seen. The confession was like a knife to the heart of everyone present. Not only had Clay betrayed them, but he'd been doing it literally behind their backs, using their own church as a meeting place for treason. Can you get us there? Elsie asked, her voice steady despite her revulsion. Yes. But they'll be watching. They'll know we're trying to escape. Then we need a distraction, Sani said. Something to draw their attention while we move. I'll do it. Harlan said, his voice firm with resolution. I'll go out the front, make noise, draw them away from the back. That's suicide, Santos protested. Maybe, Harlan replied. But it's also duty. It's what I should have done from the beginning. The sheriff's plan was desperate, but it was also their only chance. As the flames grew higher and the smoke thicker, they made their preparations. The women and children would go first, followed by the wounded, then the men who could still fight. What about him? Jake Morrison asked, pointing at Clay. He comes with us, Elsie said firmly. He's our guide, and he's also our proof. The territory needs to know what happened here. The territory needs to know he's a traitor, Jake shot back. They will, Elsie replied. But they'll hear it from him in his own words in a court of law, not from a lynch mob. As they prepared to make their desperate escape, Broken Wolf's voice echoed through the night one final time. Last chance, he called out. Send out the traitor or burn with him. The offer was tempting, but the answer was clear. They'd made their choice, and they'd live or die by it. Sheriff Harlan kicked open the burning front door, his gun blazing as he charged into the night. The sound of gunfire erupted from the front of the church, drawing the renegade's attention exactly as planned. Now, Santos whispered, and they began their desperate flight through the hidden door into the darkness of the catacombs toward an uncertain fate. Behind them, the church burned its flames, reaching toward the star-filled sky like prayers for forgiveness. And in the distance, the sound of gunfire continued, marking the sacrifice of a man who'd finally found his courage in the face of certain death. The mine tunnels were a maze of narrow passages carved from living rock, their walls black with soot and age. The air was thick and stale heavy, with the smell of earth and decay. A single torch provided their only light, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach out with grasping fingers. Elsie moved carefully through the darkness, one hand on the rough stone wall, the other helping to support Clay Dorsey. The man who'd been their leader was now their prisoner, his face a mask of shame and desperation. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued to echo through the tunnels, Sheriff Harlan's sacrifice buying them precious time. Now this way, Clay whispered, his voice barely audible. The passage splits up ahead. We take the left tunnel. Uncle, how do we know you're not leading us into a trap? Pete Sawyer asked, his young voice tight with suspicion. Because I'm trapped too, Clay replied. Broken Wolf wants me dead as much as he wants you dead, maybe more. The logic was sound, but trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Father Santos had positioned himself directly behind Clay, ready to act if the man tried anything treacherous. Tell me about the arrangement, the priest said quietly. Tell me how this all started. Clay was quiet for a long moment, his breathing labored in the thin air. It started small, he said finally. A man approached me, called himself White Hawk. Said he was a traitor, needed to know about cavalry movements to avoid conflicts. And you believed him. I wanted to believe him. The money was good, and I told myself I was preventing violence. But you knew. Sani said, his voice cutting through Clay's justifications. You knew what the information would be used for. I suspected, Clay admitted. But I didn't want to know. I needed the money too badly. They moved deeper into the tunnels, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The passage seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, a metaphor for the journey they'd all taken from innocence to complicity. The first attack. Elsie said, her voice steady despite her fear. The Henderson Ranch. Did you know it was going to happen? I knew something was planned, Clay replied. But I didn't know the details. I told myself it would just be a raid, that no one would get hurt. My husband got hurt. Martha Henderson said, her voice cold as winter wind. My husband got dead. I'm sorry, Clay said, and for the first time, he sounded like he meant it. I'm sorry for all of it. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead, Martha replied. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. The tunnel began to slope upward, and a faint current of fresh air suggested they were approaching another entrance. But as they climbed, the sounds of battle behind them grew louder, more desperate. Sheriff Harlan's distraction was working, but at a terrible cost. How much further? Thomas Walker asked, his voice tight with concern for his daughter. Not far, Clay replied. Maybe 50 yards to the cemetery entrance. They pressed on through the darkness, their torch flickering ominously. The flame was dying, and without it, they'd be lost in the labyrinthine tunnels. Elsie found herself praying not for salvation, but for the strength to see this through to the end. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered about: pickaxes, shovels, the remnants of a mining operation that had ended decades ago. In the far wall, a wooden ladder led upward to a trap door, barely visible in the gloom. "There," Clay said, pointing to the ladder. "That leads to the old shaft house behind the cemetery." Father Santos climbed first, testing the ancient rungs with his weight. The wood groaned ominously, but it held. One by one they ascended toward the surface, toward whatever fate awaited them in the world above. The trapdoor opened onto a star-filled night and the desert air cool and clean after the stifling tunnels. They emerged behind a weathered stone building, its windows dark and broken. The cemetery stretched before them, its headstones like ghostly sentinels in the moonlight. "The town's that way," Clay said, pointing toward the distant glow of flames. "But they'll be watching the roads." "Then we don't take the roads," Sani said, his voice gaining strength despite his injuries. "We go through the desert circle around approach from the east." "In the dark?" Pete Sawyer asked. "We'll get lost." Not if we follow the old prospector's trail," Thomas Walker said. "I used to hunt out here as a boy. I know the way." They set off across the desert, moving carefully through the scrub brush and cactus. The distant glow of the burning church lit their way, a beacon of destruction that marked the town they were trying to save. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued, a reminder that Sheriff Harlan was still fighting, still buying them time with his life. "He's a brave man," Father Santos said quietly, his eyes on the distant flames. "He's a fool," Jake Morrison replied. "He should have come with us." "He's doing his duty," Elsie said firmly. "Something we all should have done from the beginning." As they moved through the darkness, the weight of their situation pressed down on them like a physical force. They were refugees from their own town, betrayed by their leader, hunted by enemies who knew their every move. But they were alive, and they had the truth. That had to count for something. "There," Thomas said, pointing to a cluster of lights in the distance. "The Martinez place, or what's left of it." The homestead was a ruin, its buildings reduced to charred timbers and ash. But there were people moving among the ruined soldiers, their blue uniforms visible in the firelight. "Cavalry," Sani breathed. Harlan must have sent word before the attack. They approached the soldiers cautiously, their hands raised to show they were unarmed. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant with tired eyes, looked them over with professional assessment. "You're from Dusty Fork?" he asked. "What's left of it?" Father Santos replied. "We have information about the attacks, about who's been feeding intelligence to the renegades." The lieutenant's attention sharpened. "You know who the traitor is. We are the traitor." Clay said, his voice hollow with self-loathing. "Or I am. I sold out my neighbors for silver, and now they're paying the price." The confession hit the soldiers like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just another raid, it was the culmination of months of systematic betrayal, orchestrated by one of the town's own leaders. "We need to get back to town," the lieutenant said. "If the attack is still ongoing, it is—" Sani interrupted. "And there are innocent people trapped in that church. We need to move fast." The cavalry patrol consisted of only 12 men, but they were professional soldiers, well-armed and experienced. As they rode toward the burning town, Elsie felt a spark of hope for the first time in hours. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that they might already be too late. The church was fully engulfed now, its flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. If the townspeople were still inside, they were almost certainly dead. "The tunnels," she said suddenly. "Father, did anyone else know about the tunnels?" Santos shook his head. Only Clay and he kept that information to himself. Then the others might have found another way out, Thomas said. They might have escaped through the back. Or they might have burned, Jake Morrison said grimly, along with anyone else who trusted Clay Dorsey. The words hit Clay like a physical blow, and he slumped in his saddle. The full weight of his betrayal was crushing him, and for the first time, he seemed to truly understand what he'd done. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he whispered. I just needed the money. I just wanted to save my ranch. You saved your ranch. Elsie said, her voice cold as winter wind. You just destroyed everything else. As they approached the outskirts of town, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Several buildings were burning their flames, painting the night sky in shades of orange and red. Bodies lay scattered in the streets, both townspeople and renegades united in death, if not in life. Sweet Jesus, the lieutenant breathed. It's a massacre. It's what happens when good people trust the wrong leader, Father Santos replied. It's what happens when fear triumphs over compassion. They rode into the town center where the battle was still raging. The church was a total loss, its roof collapsed, its walls crumbling. But the fight had spread to other buildings, the general store, the saloon, the courthouse. Townspeople were barricaded inside, exchanging gunfire with renegades who seemed to be everywhere. There, Sani said, pointing to a group of people huddled behind an overturned wagon. Survivors from the church. They made it out. The cavalry charged into the fray, their rifles cracking as they engaged the renegades. The arrival of trained soldiers changed the dynamic of the battle, forcing the attackers to reconsider their tactics. But Broken Wolf was cunning, and he wasn't finished yet. Clay Dorsey. The war chief's voice boomed across the battlefield. I know you're here. Face me, you coward. Clay's face went white at the challenge. He'd been hoping to hide among the soldiers to let others fight his battles for him. But Broken Wolf wouldn't let him escape so easily. He's calling you out, the lieutenant said. You could face charges for treason, but at least you'd be alive. Would I? Clay asked. Would any of us be alive if I don't face him? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Everyone knew the answer, even if they didn't want to admit it. Broken Wolf had come for Clay specifically, and he wouldn't leave until he had his prize. I'll go with you, Sani said, struggling to dismount despite his injuries. You don't have to face him alone. You can barely stand, Clay protested. I got you into this mess. I'll get you out. We'll all go, Elsie said firmly. We'll face him together. Clay looked at her with something approaching wonder. After everything I've done, you'd still stand with me. I'm not standing with you, Elsie replied. I'm standing with the truth. And the truth is that we're all responsible for what happened here. We all let fear and hatred poison our hearts. Some more than others. Martha Henderson said pointedly. Yes, Elsie agreed. But that doesn't change our responsibility now. We have to face what we've done, and we have to find a way to make it right. They walked together into the town square where Broken Wolf waited with his remaining warriors. The war chief was an imposing figure, his face painted with symbols of death and war, his eyes burning with righteous fury. So, he said, his voice carrying across the square, the traitor finally shows his face. I'm here. Clay said, his voice steady despite his fear. Let the others go. They're not part of this. Aren't they? Broken Wolf's laugh was harsh and bitter. They all benefited from my raids. They all slept safely while I killed their enemies. They're all complicit in your betrayal. That's not true, Elsie said, stepping forward. We were lied to, manipulated, used. We didn't know what was happening. Ignorance is not innocence, Broken Wolf replied. And innocence is not absolution. The war chief's words hit like a physical blow because they contained an uncomfortable truth. The townspeople had benefited from the raids even if they hadn't known about Clay's involvement. They'd used the attacks to justify their own prejudices, their own hatred. "You're right," Father Santos said, his voice carrying across the square. "We are all complicit. We all let fear triumph over compassion, hatred triumph over understanding. But that doesn't mean we can't change. Change." Broken Wolf's voice was filled with scorn. "Your people have been promising change for generations. Empty words spoken by forked tongues. Not empty words." Sani said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Actions, choices. The decision to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous." The wounded warrior stepped forward, his movements careful but determined. "I've been tracking you for months, Broken Wolf. I know what you've done, what you've become. You're not fighting for justice anymore. You're fighting for revenge." "And what's wrong with revenge?" the war chief demanded. "What's wrong with making them pay for what they've done?" "Because it never ends," Sani replied. "Because revenge breeds more revenge, violence breeds more violence. My family is dead because of the cycle of hatred. Your family is dead because of the cycle of hatred. When does it stop?" "When they're all dead," Broken Wolf said simply. "When the last white man draws his last breath." "And then what?" Elsie asked. "When we're all dead, when the territory's empty, when there's no one left to hate, what then?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. And for a moment, Broken Wolf seemed to waver. Then his face hardened, and he raised his rifle. "Then there will be peace," he said. "No." Sani said, his voice firm with conviction. "There will be emptiness. There will be nothing but ghosts and regret." The confrontation might have continued, but it was interrupted by a new sound, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. More cavalry riding hard from the direction of the territorial capital. The governor himself, drawn by reports of the massacre, coming to restore order. "It's over," the lieutenant said. "The reinforcements are here." But Broken Wolf wasn't finished. With a cry of rage, he raised his rifle and fired not at Clay, not at the soldiers, but at Elsie. The girl who dared to show compassion to his enemy, who dared to speak of peace when all he knew was war. The shot echoed across the square like thunder, and Elsie felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through her body, but she was alive. Wounded, but alive. "Elsie!" her father cried, rushing to her side. The shot had been Broken Wolf's last act of defiance. Even as he fired, Sani's rifle cracked, and the war chief pitched forward from his horse, his painted face hitting the dust of the street he'd tried to conquer. "It's over," Father Santos said, his voice filled with exhaustion and relief. "It's finally over." But even as the words left his lips, they all knew it wasn't true. The battle was over, but the war for the soul of the territory, the war between fear and hope, hatred and understanding, would continue. The question now was which side would win. The territorial courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, every aisle packed with people who'd come to witness the trial of the century. Outside, more crowds gathered, their faces reflecting the complex emotions of a community trying to come to terms with betrayal and loss. Clay Dorsey sat at the defendant's table, his once proud bearing now reduced to hollow resignation. The silver-haired man who'd commanded such respect just weeks before now looked small and broke in his eyes, reflecting the weight of his crimes. Judge Henry Morrison, called in from the territorial capital, surveyed the packed courtroom with grave authority. The jurist had presided over many trials, but none quite like this one. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The defendant, Clayton Dorsey, stands accused of treason conspiracy and accessory to murder. How do you plead? Clay's attorney, a nervous man from the territorial capital, started to rise. Your Honor, my client. Guilty. The word cut through the courtroom like a gunshot, and every eye turned to stare at Clay. He'd risen to his feet, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Mr. Dorsey, the judge said, leaning forward. Do you understand the gravity of this plea? I understand perfectly, Clay replied. I understand that I'm guilty of every charge you want to bring against me. I understand that I caused the deaths of innocent people. I understand that I betrayed the trust of my neighbors and my country. The brutal honesty of the confession sent a chill through the courtroom. This wasn't the calculated response of a man trying to minimize his punishment. This was the desperate honesty of someone who'd finally faced the truth about himself. Tell the court what you did, Judge Morrison commanded. Clay took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces of the people he'd betrayed. I sold military intelligence to renegade bands. Patrol routes, supply schedules, safe house locations. I took silver in exchange for information that led to the deaths of 17 innocent people. Why? Because I was greedy, Clay said simply. Because I was scared of losing my ranch, my status, my position in the community. Because I was a coward who chose profit over principle. The words hung in the air like a curse, and Elsie felt tears streaming down her face. Her shoulder still ached from the bullet wound, but that pain was nothing compared to the emotional agony of seeing her community torn apart. Is there anything else the court should know? Judge Morrison asked. Clay was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his weathered face. Yes, he said finally. I'm not the only one. There are others, other officials, other businessmen who've been selling information to hostile forces. The corruption runs deeper than just me. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. If Clay was telling the truth, then the betrayal was even more widespread than anyone had imagined. Names, the judge demanded. Give me names. Clay reached into his jacket and withdrew a piece of paper, a list he'd prepared during his weeks in custody. These are the men I know about, the ones who've been taking silver from the enemy. As the bailiff handed the list to the judge, Elsie realized that Clay's final act of honesty might be his first step toward redemption. He couldn't undo the damage he'd caused, but he could prevent future betrayals. Mr. Dorsey, Judge Morrison said, his voice grave, you've confessed to crimes that resulted in the deaths of innocent people. Under territorial law, the penalty for treason is death. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for the final judgment. However, the judge continued. Your cooperation with this court and your assistance in exposing other traitors will be taken into consideration. You will be sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor. You will spend the rest of your days thinking about the lives you destroyed and the trust you betrayed. As the gavel fell, Clay seemed to age 10 years in an instant. But there was something approaching peace in his eyes, the peace that comes from finally telling the truth, no matter how terrible that truth might be. Thank you, Your Honor, he said quietly. Thank you for giving me the chance to finally do something right. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and reckoning. The territorial government launched a massive investigation into the corruption Clay had exposed, rooting out traitors and rebuilding trust in the system. It was painful work, but necessary. Elsie's shoulder healed cleanly, though she would always carry a scar from that night. But the deeper wounds, the emotional scars left by betrayal and violence, would take longer to mend. She stood now in the doorway of her father's rebuilt general store, watching the subdued activity on Main Street. The physical damage from the attack had been repaired, but the community was still fragile, still learning to trust again. How are you feeling? Thomas Walker asked, joining his daughter at the door. Better, she replied, though her voice carried the weight of all she'd experienced. Different, but better. Different how? Older, wiser, more aware of how complicated the world really is. Thomas nodded, understanding the transformation his daughter had undergone. The innocent girl who'd helped a wounded stranger was gone, replaced by a woman who'd seen the worst of humanity and chosen to fight for the best. "Any regrets?" he asked. Elsie was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the street where her neighbors went about their business with careful politeness. "No," she said finally. "I did what I thought was right. I'd do it again, even knowing what it would cost. Especially knowing what it would cost. That's what makes it right." From across the street, they could see Sheriff Harlan, scarred but alive, having somehow survived his desperate fight at the church. The man had been promoted to territorial marshal, his courage during the crisis, making him the obvious choice for the difficult job of rebuilding law and order. "He looks good," Thomas observed. "He looks like himself again," Elsie replied, "like the man he was always meant to be." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn, and they saw a familiar figure riding into town, Sani Redhawk, returning as he'd promised. The Navajo warrior looked healthier, stronger, his wounds healed, and his spirit renewed. "Sani," Elsie called out, running into the street as he dismounted. "Elsie," he said, his face breaking into a smile. "You look well." "You too. How are your people?" "Surviving, rebuilding, learning to trust again." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Like everyone else, I suppose." "Have you come to stay?" Sani shook his head. "I can't stay. My people need me. But I wanted to see you again, to thank you for what you did." "I should be thanking you," Elsie replied. "You opened my eyes to the truth." "We opened each other's eyes," Sani said. "That's what friends do." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a familiar object, the eagle feather he'd given her during their first meeting. "I want you to have this back." "I can't," Elsie protested. "It's too precious." "It's exactly because it's precious that you should have it," Sani replied. "You've earned it. You've shown the courage of the eagle, the wisdom to see truth, even when it's painful." Elsie accepted the feather with trembling hands, feeling the weight of its significance. "What does it mean for us, I mean? For our peoples?" "It means there's hope," Sani said simply. "It means that not all white men are enemies, and not all Indians are savages. It means that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to live together in peace. And if we can't, then we keep trying. We keep building bridges, one person at a time, one relationship at a time." As they spoke, more townspeople gathered, some to welcome Sani, back others to simply witness this moment of reconciliation. The faces in the crowd reflected the complex emotions of a community still learning to heal. "There's something else," Sani said, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "My people have decided to establish a trading post here. A place where our two peoples can meet in peace, exchange goods and ideas." The announcement sent ripples of excitement through the crowd. After so much violence and mistrust, the prospect of peaceful cooperation was like a beacon of hope. "While where?" asked Father Santos, who had emerged from the church to join the gathering. "On the land where the Henderson Ranch used to be," Sani replied. "Martha has agreed to sell it to us. She says it's time to build something positive from the ashes of tragedy." Martha Henderson stepped forward, her face still marked by grief, but also by a growing acceptance. "My husband would have wanted this," she said. "He believed in justice and doing what's right. This feels right." As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying news of this development back to their families, Elsie felt a deep sense of completion. The eagle feather in her hand seemed to pulse with warmth, and she knew that her mother would have been proud. "Will you come back?" she asked Sani as he prepared to leave. "I'll come back," he promised. "We'll all come back. We're part of this community now, part of this place. The good and the bad, the light and the shadow, we're all connected." "By what?" "By the truth," Sani said, swinging into his saddle. by the understanding that we're all human, all trying to do our best in a difficult world, by the hope that our children will inherit something better than what we found. As he rode away, the setting sun painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elsie felt the truth of his words settling into her heart. The story of Dusty Fork was far from over, but it was no longer a story of hatred and betrayal. It was a story of redemption, of courage, of the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal if people were willing to choose hope over fear. The eagle's feather caught the last light of day, its colors shifting from brown to gold to silver. In its beauty, Elsie saw the promise of a future where all people could live together in harmony, regardless of the color of their skin or the language of their prayers. The battle for the soul of the territory was far from over. But in this moment, in this place, hope had triumphed over hatred. And that was enough to build a better world upon. 3 months later, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the trading post opened for business. People came from miles around, white settlers and Native Americans, soldiers and civilians, believers and skeptics. They came to trade, to learn, to see if peace was really possible. Elsie stood behind the counter, her eagle feather pinned to her dress like a badge of honor. The scar on her shoulder had faded to a thin white line, but the lessons she'd learned that terrible night remained as clear as ever. "What do you think your mother would say?" her father asked, joining her as she watched the diverse crowd moving through the trading post. "I think she'd say we did the right thing," Elsie replied. "I think she'd say we chose love over fear, hope over hatred, truth over comfort." "And Clay?" Elsie was quiet for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. "I think Clay would say we gave him the chance to be better than he was. That's all any of us can ask for." As the day wore on, the trading post filled with the sounds of commerce and conversation. White settlers learning Apache words, Native Americans trying English phrases, children of all colors playing together in the dusty yard. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without tension, but it was a beginning. Father Santos had been right. Sometimes you had to tear something down before you could build it back better. The old Dusty Fork, built on fear and mistrust, was gone. In its place was something new, something hopeful, something that honored the truth rather than hiding from it. The eagle feather on Elsie's dress caught the afternoon light, its colors shifting with each movement. In its beauty, she saw the promise of a future where courage mattered more than color, where truth mattered more than tribe, where hope mattered more than hatred. It was a future worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.